by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're all here and presenting from and listening from today. Pay my respect to elders past and present
Now
and to any
arriving at
Aboriginal and Torres Strait
Murrumbeena.
Islander people joining us today. There's just some people I think have their microphones on. If we could please turn them off. I also acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and that the impacts of colonisation, dispossession and systematic discrimination continue to shape how First Nations communities experience family violence and engage with our legal and support systems, which I think is really important to keep in mind as we go through our session today. So welcome. This session is part of Victorian Law Week, which is an amazing statewide program which helps Victorians understand their rights and learn how the law works and perhaps engage with something they may not have thought of before or they may not have known about before. So today we're going to specifically look at changes to family violence laws and particularly the impacts those changes have had on some of our more vulnerable communities. So we're going to look at some reforms, what they mean in practice, particularly for people who are older, financially vulnerable, or part of the LGBTIQA plus community. My name's Bec Dahl. I'm a partner at Nicholes Family Lawyers. We work closely with people obviously navigating these systems, but also with community service organisations and other organisations who are really helping to protect those who are most at risk. And I am beyond excited to be joined by this panel of experts today, many of whom we do get to work with as part of that work, which we're very lucky. So starting from the top, we have Commissioner Jo Ball. Jo is the Victorian Commissioner for LGBTIQA plus communities. Jo brings today and always, I suppose, a statewide policy and systems lens on how family and sexual violence, financial distress and isolation affect LGBTIQA plus people. From WIRE, we have their CEO, Jade Blakkarly. WIRE is another amazing organisation who support women, non-binary and gender diverse people experiencing financial stress, family violence and other forms of disadvantage. From Switchboard, we have Ellazam, who is the Policy and Advocacy Lead. Switchboard work closely with LGBTI communities, including people who may be isolated or at higher risk of abuse and discrimination. And then last but not least, we have Luke Wright. Luke is a senior manager at State Trustees. And for those who don't know, State Trustees play a pivotal role in helping people who can't manage their own finances and also responding to concerns about elder abuse and financial exploitation. So thank you to all these wonderful people for being a part of our session today. If you do have questions, please put them in the chat. And depending on how we go, I will get to them at the end if I can. But I can tell you in advance, these people have so many wonderful things to say that we might have to see how we go with that. So I guess as a little bit of an opener or a background, we've had some changes to recent family violence laws, particularly in Australia. Victoria, but all over Australia. But one of the particularly significant things here was the Family Violence, Stalking and Other Matters Bill. And what that did was make some changes to our existing Family Violence Protection Act. And it expanded the legal definition of family violence to better capture some behaviours, things like stalking, systems abuse and harm to animals. It also strengthened the intervention order process and strengthened protection for witnesses, vulnerable people, those experiencing coercive and controlling behaviours, and also improved protections for witnesses and vulnerable court participants. So that's the legal overview. And what we really want to unpack today is what do these reforms actually mean and what do they say for the people who are experiencing these situations, those who are most vulnerable, how that shows up and what are the gaps and what can we do, I suppose, in that space. So I'm going to start letting everyone, I suppose, do a little bit of an introduction of themselves, some of the work they do. So, Maya, I might start with you. If you're happy to, I'd love to hear about your work with LGBTIQA plus communities at Switchboard and what Switchboard kind of focuses on, I suppose, for those who might be isolated or vulnerable.
Absolutely. Thanks, Bec. So Switchboard has been working with LGBTIQA plus communities for over 30 years. We began in 1991 in response to the HIV and AIDS epidemic. And so we've seen a lot of change over our time. We work across Victoria and also do some advocacy on a national scale, particularly through our suicide prevention work. And I guess over that time, we've seen a lot of things change in our communities. But what we really have aimed to do and what we continue to do is to really try and meet our communities where they're at. And really have tried to, I guess, understand and shift the systems that really impact our communities' abilities to stay connected, to move through experiences of isolation, and to really shift, I guess, these framings of vulnerability from being about individual community members to being about the systems that create the conditions for vulnerability for our communities. And I guess in that, really wanting to acknowledge the strengths and creativity of LGBTIQA plus communities that has always existed, where maybe the systems, the legal frameworks that we exist within aren't always able to meet our needs or protect us from harm. So I guess practically, Switchboard does that through a variety of different ways. We interact with LGBTIQA plus communities across Victoria, across the spectrum of needs. So we deliver our Rainbow Door helpline, which provides specialist support and referral to our communities experiencing family violence, abuse, mental health concerns, alcohol and other drug concerns, and housing insecurity. We deliver Q Life, which is an anonymous support phone line for LGBTIQA plus people and their loved ones. For older LGBTI plus people, we deliver a Pride in Aging program, which reduces social isolation and tackles ageism and works with local communities in regional Victoria. And then we also deliver suicide prevention programming, Rainbow Families programming, and programming for queer, trans, and intersex Black people, First Nations people, and people of colour. With all of these programs being delivered by LGBTIQA plus peers with specialist knowledge around caring for our communities. Yeah, sorry, hard to do that in a quick summary.
I was going to say just a bit there. No, thank you so much, Maya. Joe, moving to you, in your role as commissioner, you, I suppose, have a statewide view over how law reform lands in practice with community and I suppose different intersections of community. What are some of the stories, I suppose, with reference to what we're talking about today with these legal changes? What's some of the things you're hearing from the community that you're working in?
Yeah, thanks, Bec, and it's nice to be here. For those who don't know, I'm a non-lawyer talking to lawyers about the law. Some would say that's inevitable, it's not an enviable task, but but some of the things that I guess I wanted to talk about, as a commissioner, I'm a senior public servant, and I am an advocate too and across government, and a lot of my role is consulting with community and bringing lived experience into government, bringing that lived experience voice into government. Some of the things that I think are really important to understand about our communities is that our rights are fairly recent, some very, very recent. And so you can't be protected by the law if the law doesn't, when you're talking about the overarching family violence reforms, we can't be protected under them if your own identity is not protected under the law. So, like, for example, the intersex reform that came through just this year, which was stopping harmful and unnecessary surgeries on intersex babies, it's a very, very recent law. Another law of marriage equality is very recent. And prior to that, de facto legislation, the changes to the de facto law so that LGBTIQA plus or same-sex couples particularly were seen as the same as other de facto couples is all very recent. The right to be on your child's birth certificate as a non-birthing same-sex parent, very recent in Victoria. The right to be the gender of your choice on the birth certificate of your child and on your own birth certificate. All of these are within the last 5 or 10 years. Adoption law is recent. IVF reform is very recent. So these are all in the last 10 years, which are just basic baseline getting access to how to start a family, how to form relationships, how to have your relationships protected. And I think that's sort of something to keep in mind when we talk about how does the family law recent changes. We've got to see it within the context that we've only really recently been protected through, and by extension of that is anti-vilification legislation. You know, up until very recently, it was okay for you to stand on the steps of Parliament steps as they did stand on the steps of Parliament House and unfurl an extremely a banner that threatened to kill members of the transgender community, and that was, you know, now that is something that's illegal. So I think that's the context that I see it in. I think, however, when you say what do people think about all that, I mean, I think that these are all like legal progress, very important progress fought for by people from our community, and championed by our allies at all levels, our legal allies and our political allies. But what I find is a lot of people still don't know necessarily whether they have those rights. And that's the role of something like Law Week. You know, it's about translating that. What do those policies mean? What do those laws mean on the actual like day-to-day basis of a police officer at your door, you in family law, you in the public space? And I think I think there's a huge lag behind that. People still think that a lot of the way people are treated, discrimination that they're treated, is acceptable and legal. So yeah, that's just a bit of an intro.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. And perfect articulation of the law. Very impressive. Jade, to you, people who perhaps haven't engaged with WIRE or don't know much about what WIRE does, who are the sorts of people that are contacting you at WIRE, and what issues are you most commonly seeing, particularly, I suppose, talking about family violence and financial stress?
Yeah, thanks, Bec, and I'm really glad to be here as well. So I've been working across Victoria for a bit over 40 years, and we've always had a core role to support women and now trans and gender diverse people to access information and support they need to make their own decisions. So in doing that, we provide a free accessible telephone service, online service. We run events in the community, information sessions, a whole different range of ways of trying to reach people. And I guess from having been around for a while as an organisation, what we see is that a lot of people who are contacting us, there's probably two key groups of people. There's a group of people that don't know where to start. So, you know, we're one of the few services that any woman, transgender, diverse person can ring about anything. You don't have to fit into a particular issue. And so we get a lot of people calling us who just really want to unpack what's happening. They know things are not great. They know there's stuff wrong. They're not quite sure how to articulate it. So we have a lot of people in that circumstance, and particularly people who might not know, you know, speaking about law, know their rights, know what's available, know how to access that system. And then the other group of people who we have a lot of contact with are people where the system has created barriers or created vulnerabilities that mean they can't access it. So they're people who've tried to get through the system and it hasn't worked. Often they might be members of communities that have been marginalised. A lot of people calling us with financial pressure, people in family violence, people who've left family violence but now don't quite know what to do, and the system says, oh, it's a bit late now. So that's kind of really who we're working with on that individual level, is people who are really not sure where to go and are having trouble navigating our systems, really.
And Luke, to you, so State Trustees, sometimes I think one of those organisations we've heard of but might not quite be sure what they do. Could you talk to us about what State Trustees does in terms of supporting people who can't manage their finance, and particularly some of the vulnerable people that you're working with?
Sure, Bec, thank you. So State Trustees is a government-backed organisation, the Public Trustee of Victoria, and we've been around for 80 plus years. So we perform a variety of functions, including deceased estate administration, managing trusts, writing wills and powers of attorney. I work in the area where the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal, or VCAT, can appoint the State Trustees to be someone's financial administrator in circumstances where they have been found to lack decision-making capacity and need decision-making support. And so many of we act for around 8,000 Victorians in that capacity, varying spectrums from young, maybe with an intellectual disability, to an older person who might have dementia. And we know that people with a disability are disproportionately affected by family violence, and violence. I think people are 2.6 times more. A person with a disability is 2.6 times more likely to experience intimate partner violence, for example. But we see we're often appointed in circumstances where an older person has been financially abused, usually by a family member. So yeah, that's a role we play with a lot of passion, and I'm really happy to be here today.
Thank you so much, Luke. What's really clear from what the four of you have said is that there's a lot of vulnerable people and there's a really diverse range of vulnerable people, and that vulnerability can show up in many different ways. If we're talking about particularly the LGBTIQA plus community, what concerns or situations do you see come up around vulnerability or potential exploitation or abuse, perhaps?
For sure. Thanks, Bec. I mean, I guess really building off what Joe was saying around like this broader framing of just how recent our rights are. I think it provides a lot of really rich context to understand some of the particular things that LGBTIQA plus people really experience, and maybe how these like systemic things really impact interpersonally our capacity to build relationships, build families. We continue to live within a society that privileges, heteronormative relationship types, and that means that LGBTIQA plus relationships or chosen family structures or families are less likely to be understood or legitimized by broader society, especially considering, as Joe said, the really recent and ongoing, legal negotiations and legal wins around our rights and capacities to build a family. And, then we also think about the histories of criminalization for our communities, but also, as we see ongoingly, when debate around our community's legitimacy and our rights is something that becomes, a political football on a state level, on a national level, we really see an environment that really supports, I guess, the conditions for our communities to experience abuse and vulnerability and exploitation, whether that is systemic or within individual relationships. And I think that leads to a lot of things. It means that LGBTIQA plus people may not always have the tools or information to identify abuse or exploitation when it's happening. As Jade was saying, sometimes it can be really challenging to articulate these things. LGBTIQA plus people also may be experiencing abuse or exploitation based on their gender identity or expression or their sexuality, which can really enhance these feelings of stigma and shame, particularly when we aren't existing in a framework where our rights are continually upheld, or that's been fairly recent. But also something that is really important in terms of maybe this idea of vulnerability or what might open LGBTIQA plus people up to abuse is that a person's abuser might also represent their only or one of few connections to their family or to the broader LGBTIQA plus community. And that can really complicate what it means to either identify and acknowledge that abuse is happening or to reach out for support and take action. And we know that when our communities do reach out for support, that can be really challenging because of fear of discrimination, fear of not being believed, fear of their relationship not being understood or validated. And we also know that trans, non-binary and gender diverse community members might experience barriers reaching out to gendered violence services, for instance, and all the things that come with that.
Absolutely. And I guess, Joe, building on from that, a couple of things I think Maya mentioned in terms of, firstly, I suppose some of the intersection, transphobia, homophobia, racism, ableism that people are dealing with as well. And also the other thing I think that, to touch on is about that public discourse about people and what that can mean when these sorts of things are debated in public. I'm kind of interested to see on both of those lenses what you think there.
Sure, and look, I'm just gonna bring the elephant in the room, which is giggle versus tickle. And the call in the last 3 days for an amendment to the Sex Discrimination Act in Australia. And just going to make an assumption that people know what I'm talking about and just talk to the substantive issue rather than outline what I'm talking about. And also make the point that, of course, that giggle versus tickle will probably go to the High Court, may go to the High Court now. So it is not a resolved issue. I think that, what I see in this awful framing is that, like, rather than seeing human rights and things that are under human rights that fall really clearly as family violence human rights, which is the right to safety, the right to freedom, the right to expression, these kind of things, is that they're undermined by an argument that human rights lack abundance, that human rights, there's only a certain amount of human rights. And if we give out too many of them, at some point it will tip and rights will go into conflict. And this is something that lawyers have to contest with all the time, right? Is the idea of rights in conflict. But I think that it becomes a really dangerous framing in the human rights space. And I think that's what happens with this argument around amending the Sex Discrimination Act. It's sort of this idea that things have somehow one group, one type of woman, is receiving too many rights, or potentially too many rights, and that's going to impact like all women. Now, like, there is no evidence that that's the case, because we have two clear examples. The probably most clearest example is the Gender Recognition Act in the UK that's been amended. There is no evidence with that amendment that women in the UK are experiencing less violence, that they're receiving more support, that their organisations are being funded. So there isn't the idea that the abundance comes from limiting some people's rights is farcical. I mean, the other thing is we've seen out of the US is that where these kind of rights in conflict can go to is because you imply that just this week Trump made the comment that gender ideology as well as other ideologies, transgender ideology is a dangerous anti-American ideology, and at the end of that statement he said, "We will find you and we will kill you." This is the president of the United States making a death threat against a range of what he sees as ideologies, but what's behind those ideologies is actually people. And one of those groups of people was transgender people. And I think that, so there's no evidence, and I don't think that a threat from the United States president to kill any part of the constituency makes anyone else safer. There's no evidence of that. And so I think that that's what I see in these debates, is this idea that you stay safe when you turn on each other, or that, that there's some kind of mythical tipping point of too much human rights. And I think that, and actually what it leads to is, like, how do we actually police this? Like, how would we police these laws? The tipping points becomes actually, how do we police them? And we've got the Los Angeles Olympic Games, which is going to be a really interesting test for privacy. Like, all women athletes blanketly are going to be subject to a genetics test. That is a huge breach of human rights, in my opinion, and it's a huge breach of privacy. Who is holding those thousands and thousands of genetic tests? And the athletes are in a really precarious position. You don't submit them, you don't get to play. And this is things that people work for their whole life for. So they're not really in a position to bargain, about, like, how do you ensure that that information isn't handed over to a whole range of sources? How do you ensure that data is secure? And should you even have that data in the first place? And of course, what's going to come out of that data is some people are going to find out things about themselves genetically they would not have found out previously. So there's going to be a bunch of people who found out they're intersex. Absolutely. And what's the care and the concern there? So I think that, these are the cultural wars, but they're not just ideological. That's what's really important, is they're actually undermining individual people's safety. And then they play out in the community sphere, street-based violence, things like J.K. Rowling saying, "I want people to take photos in change rooms of people they think are transgender." Oh my God, we've just done this whole child protection thing of not taking photos of children in change rooms, and now we've got people calling for this, take pictures of people in change rooms. Absolutely not. So I think that there's these real life implications of lack of safety in the family violence space. How it plays out is that, it can be a weaponized thing in interpersonal relationships as well, because once someone doesn't have equal rights, you can, or their very existence is under threat, you can hold that over them in a family violence situation. You can threaten to out them. You can threaten to not allow them to pick up their PBS, their pharmaceutical benefit scheme subscriptions. Lots of on and on. So But I think that that's what I want people to come away from probably this session from myself this week, is about just totally disregarding the idea of rights in conflict and seeing it as dangerous as it is, and it is dangerous at every level.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Joan. Thank you for bringing the elephant into the room. It's a really important one. So thank you very much for that. Jane and Luke, I want to talk to you a little bit from your perspectives about some of the financial factors that we can see in some of this family violence and these communities we're looking at. Jade, at WIRE, we know you speak to a wide range of people who are experiencing financial pressures, but what patterns do you see when that pressure is part of financial abuse in intimate or family relationships for women and gender diverse people?
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to say thanks to Jo for raising that important issue as well. For us, I think what I'd start off by saying is we very, very rarely see any family violence that doesn't include financial abuse. It's a very, very common, one of the most common forms of family violence we see, and it's so intersecting and integrated with all of the other types of family violence. So it's rare to talk to someone who's experiencing family violence who's not experiencing financial abuse. But at the same time, it's still very misunderstood, even by people experiencing it. It's one of those issues people struggle to articulate. So we see a lot of people who talk to us about not having control over financial decisions, not being able to access their money, access resources they need for their health, having people trying to stop them going to work or maintaining employment really, really difficult. People who end up with debts that are built up that they didn't know about or were coerced into getting. And I think at a time like this, when so much of the community is facing financial pressure, I think that those issues of financial abuse get really exacerbated because, it's really difficult to make decisions to leave, to change the situations when you're already under financial pressure. And then, our housing crisis, the cost of living issues, all the things that all of us are experiencing. But when you add control and power abuse over that, it makes it even more difficult. And I think the other thing I think we forget is that financial abuse is one of those aspects of family violence that's really most likely to continue even if you leave. So it's hard to leave. Financial abuse makes leaving really hard, practically, emotionally, financially. But at the same time, even leaving rarely gets people away from that form of abuse. And this is the thing I think when we're thinking about the work that everyone's doing, we're thinking about systems and how systems are contributing to that, whether it's through things like child support, things like property settlements. There's a whole range of ways, but we often find the legal systems and our financial systems continue to enable, I guess, and facilitate unintentionally financial abuse to continue beyond people leaving. So it's not quite as simple as off you go and then you're okay.
And I think that's important. I think that's important when we're talking about vulnerability, that it isn't just that moment in the relationship. It can be the subsequent circumstances. And Luke, from your vantage point as state trustees, particularly thinking about older people, what are some of the things that you see where you have concerns about people's vulnerability in relation to their money or property, and some of the, I suppose, red flags, for want of a better phrase, that might come up?
Sure, thanks. I think it's important when we talk about elder abuse and especially financial or economic elder abuse, it's a form of family violence. And I suppose, Jade, I couldn't have said it better than a lot of the flags that you raised, but it's one of the important distinctions is that we know that women remain more likely to be affected overall by family violence in the form of elder abuse. But that said, the gender differences appear to narrow as the older age, as people age, and so factors like dependency, isolation, cognitive decline, Dependency, especially in the context of English as a second language, often more reliant on other people around them to help them out. We really see that the narrowing of the gender gap. Having said that, women are still more likely to be victims of financial elder abuse. To add to some of the flags that Jade flagged, I mean, specifically, you see maybe behaviours of concern or red flags might be a sudden change in someone's will or their powers of attorney. They might go to the lawyer and feel under pressure and want to change. So encourage lawyers to really examine the dynamics of that, because sometimes impairment or cognitive declines might not be so obvious. Larger unexplained transfers of money, unpaid bills, even when the person has adequate assets. Isolation, so often a common scenario, we see one person isolate an older person to get benefit from that. So there's some of the red flags I'd like to highlight.
Thanks, Luke. And I think that that isolation is something I really want to pick up on, because I think that isolation and vulnerability unfortunately go hand in hand, and we know that. So, Joe, to you, in your line of work, are there particular groups within, I suppose, the broader LGBTIQA plus community that you think are especially vulnerable to isolation and abuse, or that you are, I suppose, particularly concerned about in that regard?
I think maybe one way to talk about this is that when we're talking about risk or risk management, as we have in Victoria, like the Marin risk assessment and things, it is really important at the outset to say that we are not a risk. The risk is what is done to us and the culture around it that perpetuates it. Because I think sometimes what I would say is what happens to our communities is that we get sort of problematized as a risk to service delivery. How are we going to manage refuge with men, for example? LGBTIQA plus includes men. When you talk about LGBTI family violence, how are we going to manage men in refuge and not just send men with children to homeless shelters? How are we going to, or any man, or how are we going to not make assumptions? And this is sort of you can pull out particular groups, but I think what I see is more the themes of what happens is that some groups are seen as more at risk, which can be a bias. And what I really encourage people to do is to think about in their practice is that to judge the person based on the risk that is happening to them, not their body as a risk. So, for example, if a man comes to a family violence service and he's genuinely, you can see that you do all the risk assessment and there's a very high risk he's going to be killed by his partner. Right? And the risk assessment can be sometimes with men, which we've seen in the past, and this came out in the Royal Commission, the Inter-Family Violence in Victoria, people looked at this stuff, which was that, they say, oh, well, the man is going to be more likely to be okay to sleep in his car. He's going to be more likely okay to fight back against his perpetrator. He's going to be more and I think these things are assumptions and biases that are not necessarily based on the person who's sitting right in front of you. And I think we can't let the person right in front of you disappear around your own kind of assumptions, which can have a gendered lens around that all women and children are always a priority, or all cisgendered women, or all heterosexual women are more at risk than, say, whatever your bias comes to play. You might go, oh, there's 2 women, so it's less likely she's going to be killed by her female partner. You can't let the data overwhelm the person in front of you. You've got to still be able to see the person. And of course, there is currents and trends and information that tell us about our practice. But I think a lot of the time we can't let that crowd out. And so I see that as a problem. For example, where people will say, well, Joe, it's all very, I know people have said this to my face in genuine terms. They've said it's all very good that you're bringing new people into the family violence system by, doing campaigns to say you too deserve to have a response. But Joe, we've got to deal with the people who are already, the priority, or the people who are already here. And it's well, yes, of course, but it's not that is a complication that we all need to work on at a sector and system level. but you don't do that by just saying, well, before I even let this person walk in the door, I've decided that they're lesser risk because of their gender. You've got to still go through the processes of establishing it, and I think that comes to bear. There's a prime example of this, and I'm cognizant that this is still going through courts, but in New South Wales, when the two men were killed by someone that was known to them. And the two gay men, I think people know this happened, and some of the assumptions that we heard that came out of that process, that people, even though there was risks of killing, there was like a lot of evidence was built up that there was a lot of risk to life, and afterwards, and she, of course, she did apologise, and so she should have, but the acting police commissioner said what we're seeing here is a crime of passion. Two people were murdered, and their bodies were disposed of, right? Like, we don't call that, what's passionate about that, but I think that's when the assumptions and the bias comes into the room, and we fought so hard as feminists to change that question for women and children. And I think if we let it diminish for anybody, it diminishes for everybody. And so, like, let's not let those things creep into the conversation. Oh, that trans woman, well, she looked very trans. So, like, of course, her partner, got angry at her or something and hurt her and harmed her. Where the same adage of however you dress, wherever you go, yes means yes, no means no. The fact, our bodies, our lives, our right to decide. The feminist discourse applies to anybody in these positions of vulnerability, and like, we can't let it slip for communities, otherwise we start to let it encroach on all of us. And so I think that's where I see the vulnerability, actually, is this sort of idea that we don't bring the feminist lens to all of our work, and when you don't do that, vulnerability comes in. And I'll leave it there.
No, thank you. That's great. Maya, Luke touched on, I suppose, some of the signs for particularly older people. But we do know that for older LGBTIQA plus people, sometimes family support can be even more limited or more complicated, perhaps, than for our broader older community. How does that isolation and that particular vulnerability potentially impact, and also what role does connection and community play for those people?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Bec. And yeah, building off what Luke was saying, I guess if we're specifically speaking about the context of LGBTI plus older people, and I use, I guess, the acronym LGBTI plus, which is a bit different because we hear feedback from older people in our communities that the word queer and the Q carries a lot of stigma and has been used as a slur to harm people. And while that's been reclaimed, for older people, it still carries that weight, or it can still carry that weight. So that's just explaining why I'm using a different acronym. But I guess if we really think about the context for an older LGBTI plus person who, has maybe lived through legacies of criminalization, horrific legacies of conversion and suppression practices, which we are still seeing only recently, it being enshrined into different law, that those are outlawed. We see pathologization, the HIV/AIDS epidemic. We can see this real, the way that systems have continued to harm LGBTI plus people, particularly older LGBTI plus people, over their lives. But as people age, they often become more reliant on systems. Particularly, Luke was mentioning, intersectional identity around people with experiences of disability. As people age, there may be the emergence of new or the exacerbation of existing disabilities. And, for people who, have developed, for very real reasons, systemic distrust and an understanding that the systems that are meant to support us are not actually there to support us, they actually harm us often. What then happens when you're aging and you have to rely more on those systems? Maybe you're less connected to your community, largely because maybe a lot of your community actually has also died. We also understand that, as you mentioned, Bec, like, family support might be a lot more complicated. Older LGBTI plus people may lack intergenerational family support. We know that this means that they might be living with higher rates of psychological distress, depression, anxiety, may have had previous experiences of family violence, and also seeking to then move into the aged care system. And we know that maybe that is a space that is still progressing towards upholding the dignity of people in these spaces. And when you've had a whole lifetime of your dignity being limited, experiencing systemic harm, having your rights questioned and debated, seeing the impact that that has on yourself and your community, what does it then mean to be moving into these spaces? We know that a lot of older LGBTI plus people moving into the aging and aged care system also sometimes feel that they need to, or need to go back into the closet as well. There is a fear of being outed, what that's going to mean. And there are also these components around digital literacy and actually for older LGBTI plus people, how they can actually navigate the systems that they need to, or be supported to access the systems that they need to, and engage in digital systems as well. And I guess that paints, I guess, a pretty challenging picture when we're talking about isolation and connection for older LGBTI plus people. All of these things create the conditions for isolation. And I think what's, again, really important to say in that is that older LGBTI plus people in our communities, they're still here. The amount of wisdom and strength that exists within that is so powerful. And I guess in speaking to all of those systemic impacts and the isolation that that creates, I really want to recognize and for people to take away, I guess that, again, as Joe was saying, like the person in front of you holds wisdom and strength in what they need to remain connected. And I think that really illuminates where community connection can play this really essential role in supporting isolated LGBTI plus older people. When people are connected in with others in their community who maybe understand these historical contexts, who understand why people have distrust in systems, who understand some of these complexities, but also can connect with someone and celebrate the identity and the strength that they hold, that can be incredibly powerful. And that can then provide an avenue, particularly through, organizations like Switchboard or like WIRE, who really serve to like meet people where they're at and connect people in with broader communities or services that can meet their needs. That initial feeling of connection and being able to speak to someone who understands all of that and can say, I haven't, lived your life, but I understand, and I can now walk this path with you and help connect you to other people that can support you. That's incredibly powerful, particularly when people are experiencing isolation in all of these different ways.
Luke, my question to you, I think, sort of picks up on that point about dignity a little bit, because we know state trustees often become involved when someone's decision-making capacity is in question. How do you think about balancing the need to protect someone against the importance of, I suppose, their autonomy, their relationships, and respecting that?
It's the billion-dollar question, Bec. Historically, we know that decision makers generally impose paternalistic or best interest-based approaches when supporting people with decision-making impairments. Victoria, and through Victorian law, the Law Reform Commission and recommendations is quite advanced in terms of our Guardianship and Administration and Powers of Attorney Acts. It really pushes and the move towards focusing on people's rights, will and preferences is the term that we use. And so there's been a big shift in the last 10 years in Victoria to that approach. And so really, moving away from best interests into, giving effect to what people want, even if it might be seen as objectively unwise. Having said that, will and preferences of people can be sometimes weaponized or coerced, especially in family violence situations. So there remains a sort of a protective, the balance of protection and promotion of a person's rights and dignity is the challenging thing. The starting point is always what the person wants, but there is a safeguarding role there to make sure that we protect them from serious harm where appropriate.
Yeah, great. Joe, one of the parts of your role is making sure, or playing a part in making sure, that systems, government systems, other systems are inclusive and accessible. Big question, but from where you sit, what do you think are the biggest systemic barriers that LGBTIQ plus people are facing when they try and engage with police, courts, legal, Centrelink, housing, just to name a few, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of where I probably started at the very beginning is a good place to begin, which is that, like, people's understanding of their rights. Like, I think that a lot of I regularly talk to people who don't realise that the thing they're actually telling me about is not a complaint. It's actually like a violation of like a whole range of codes, for example, of like including human rights abuse, and people don't know pathways to making complaints, and they often are taking. I think that's one is understanding your rights and being able to advocate for yourself. I think there's also a mistrust in systems that is current and also historical. When you're thinking about that, the national decriminalisation of homosexuality was 1997. So you wouldn't have gone to the police prior to that, and people didn't, for being gay bashed, because there was a high chance that you yourself would be arrested, and people were. And I think that's really important. People have those things in their lived memory, and they're passed on. And I think so there's a mistrust in systems, and then people have current mistrust in systems for just like things where police or systems can just be dismissive of whether something is going to be successful. I hear that as well, like people being told, well, like, oh, yes, that might be against the law that person did this or that, but like there's not it's not going to be very successful. Like that's, yes, you were verbally abused terribly on public transport. Maybe you're even pushed over, but like people are sort of like again, it becomes that thing of like prioritizing, but it's not the role of us as service navigators, service providers to dissuade people from enacting their rights. Our thing is to give people real options of what they have. And I think there's many examples where I work with people like Victoria Police who do just that. They lay out the options for people of what criminal as well as victim support services, and some people do a really great job. However, it is really unequal. And back to your previous question, sometimes it can be really equal based on location. And I don't mean just rurally. It can be in different suburbs, in different places. There's a lot of work going on at the moment, for example, to get all Victoria Police trained in LGBTIQA plus inclusion practices. That's a huge undertaking, and people don't have a lot of time to do any kind of training. So it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of cultural shift work as well, like getting people, and working with a traumatized workforce, but, and a workforce that's constantly, if any other workplace is constantly politicized, it's police, particularly in the lead up to an election. So, they're under pressure, and I think, we can be sympathetic to that, but also like, that doesn't change the fact that our role as advocates and things, or system providers is not, our role is not to dissuade people, and to, even though it might be quite realistic. And again, that comes back to, I think, that feminist lens that I think is really useful. And we've fought for that as feminists for a long time. Lots of women who went around sexual assault and rape cases were told, well, it's unlikely we're going to pin it on him in the courts. It's going to be really traumatizing. Do you really want to go ahead and do that? That is often the reality. People do not get a lot of like healing through the court system. That is absolutely true. But it's not our role to dissuade people from seeking the justice that they want to. And we have to be really careful, I think, about dissuading people. So I think that's a really mistrusting systems. How some of the system navigation is handled is a big barrier. I think as long as there's culture wars flaming up, it's very difficult to get people to take this on as a priority and not bring their biases into workplaces. There's a battle on at the moment about whether organisations should sign up to things like pride and diversity, whether they should be a part of these accreditation bodies. Should people still do rainbow tick? These are things that I think everyone should do, but they are becoming more of a debate field rather than they ever were. And I think at the moment we're sort of, unfortunately, we're going down, is what I would say if I was going to give an honest assessment in regards to equality and perception of equality and actual equality for LGBTI people. I think we're going a bit down, and a lot of communities are going down with us. So I think it's actually, to flip that around, is that there's a vested interest for lots of us who may or may not have intersections of being LGBTIQA plus, but do have the intersection with us of having their rights declining, to work together to champion, to champion our rights going back up, and systems being better. And a framework that I've been thinking about lately is abundance. I think we're really asked a lot. This is a bit of a trending idea in the US politics at the moment, is the politics of abundance, if people haven't come across it. But we're really told, as people who are advocates, we're told to always consider that things are not abundant. And so to make our claims and our things as if we have already been told, as if we are already holding in our minds that we've got to juggle and prioritize things. And I think actually we need to reject that a little bit and try and work within a period of abundance and start asking for what we need, not what we think we'll get.
Yeah, amazing. And I think one of the things that can't hurt, right, when we're dealing with these systems is collaboration between services, systems, people, all of those things working towards abundance. Jade, to you, WIRE, I suppose, is one of the great collaborators in that sense in the service that's provided. But what do you think effective collaboration can look like within all of our different systems to support people who are experiencing financial and other abuse?
Yeah, thanks, Bec. I think what I would start with is saying, in a similar vein to some of what Joe was saying, most of the people contacting us are experiencing mistrust of services, poor, negative experiences, lack of knowledge about what's available, and lack of knowledge about their rights. So I think that's kind of where we need to assume people are starting from. People are not reaching out going, great, I know I can do all this, now just let me know who I talk to. People are ringing from that place of not knowing, and that again is that created vulnerability by the systems. And I think so in that, we really value collaboration. It's a key value of ours, but it's also a reality and a necessity. We're small and we're trying to cover the whole state, so we need to work together. But I think as well for individuals who are contacting us, we're really lucky. We've got some fantastic professional legal and financial specialist support, so individuals are able to get fast, easier access to specialist individual lawyers and financial advice and things like that. And so that makes a real difference, obviously, in that moment for those people to be able to get that help and navigate those systems. But more broadly, the collaborations also help us to provide information, resources, extend our reach and extend our knowledge into communities, particularly communities that don't know about legal rights and about accessing supports and what they can and can't do and how to complain and all of those things. And then I'd say at an advocacy and systems kind of level, that collaboration enables us to share what we learn from the amazing communities we talk to, what we hear every day, and to help amplify that, in an advocacy space, in a systems change space, because it means we're able to, work. We've got some really trusted and valued partnerships in the legal sector, in the justice system, in other systems, and collectively we're able to bring those things together, and it really helps create the longer term change that we're trying to do. And I think for me, that's where that sort of, that quote about if you want to get somewhere fast, go by yourself, but if you want to go far, go with others. I think that really resonates when we're talking about the kind of key systems changes that we need to make for and with communities that are really experiencing a whole range of complex things, and particularly where they've been marginalised from and deliberately excluded from systems.
Absolutely. Now, I can't believe I'm up to my last round of questions because you have all just been amazing and very thought-provoking, but I'm going to probably give one last question to all of you. So, Maya, to start with you, if you could change one thing, just one, in I suppose the system, if I can call it that, to better protect LGBTIQA plus people, what would that be?
I mean, look, there's the one thing.
No, one was unfair, but
yeah, it's really looking at what you've heard today around like the structural disadvantage in our communities, the way that the systems are set up to continually, I guess, enhance isolation, prevent or debate the legal rights of our communities. There is so much strength and creativity in LGBTIQA plus communities, and we really need to see political shifts that support protections for our communities. We need to see a service sector that recognises the reality of everything that we've been speaking about today and is working, as Jade said, in a collaborative way to respond to these. Until we do that, we can't meaningfully prevent abuse and exploitation of LGBTIQA plus people. We just can't. We really need to address those drivers and those systems to prevent abuse at its roots. And while we're getting there, appropriately resourcing the support services that can connect people to the people that are working in this space need to be sustainably funded to promote that collaboration, promote this ongoing advocacy, things like this. Yeah.
Amazing. Like, if you could leave older or perhaps otherwise vulnerable people with one key message about their rights or safeguards around their money and property, what would you most want them to hear today?
I think the key message is that you decide who decides. So needing support with decision making should never be mean that you lose your rights or your voice is taken away. The system is in place to safeguard people and promote their human rights and dignity, and that's what the decision makers need to do when they're supporting people.
Wonderful, thank you. Jade, from you, what would you really like professionals and community members to keep in mind and remember about financial vulnerability and abuse, particularly for women and gender diverse people that you work with?
Well, I think the thing that sticks with us is that it is really embedded in a lot of the systems, and it lasts a long time, and the consequences of that are really high. So we know that long after victim survivors have left relationships, their economic well-being is not very good, and as a system we focus a lot and we think a lot about safety and how do we support women, transgender, diverse people to be safe in relationships. That's really key. We need people to be safe. Obviously we don't want people being killed, and that's been a priority and it's been an important priority. The cost of that is it means we sometimes forget about what happens afterwards, and we know that for too many people that have been through violence and abuse, poverty is a long-term consequence for them. They end up in poverty, and that's where they unfortunately stay too often because we don't respond to that. And what we need to remember in that is that poverty itself, it's more trauma. So whilst on one hand we think we've helped people get out of some unsafe situations, we've actually left them in a situation of trauma, which is of course going to impact their capacity and ability to heal and recover and what happens into the future. And I think that's a really important thing to remember is, our actions now, we need to really be still thinking about and responding to the long-term impacts for people.
Absolutely. And Joel, finish with you. What message would you like LGBTIQA plus Victorians themselves to take away about their rights, their safety and their supports under the law in Victoria?
Look, I think it's really important that people think about this as things are definitely improving. The Royal Commission, did deliver supported training for family violence services to do the rainbow tick. People were really written into that plan, and it's made a material difference. I think there's also incredible allies and organisations. I mean, yourself, Bec, Nicholes Lawyers have done incredible work. You deserve a shout out for the cases you've taken on. Across the spectrum for rainbow families and parents of transgender diverse kids. I don't know where we would be without the partnership of law firms like your own that have just really stepped up and provided that. Well, we've got community legal services, but they cannot do the kind of cases and detail the work that you've done. It has to be a partnership, and I think people need to know that there's a lot of what I see out in community is people are really distressed. Parents of transgender diverse kids are really distressed. Rainbow families are really distressed. People are wondering what the world they're bringing their child into, and trans people are distressed. We've got gay and bisexual men being bashed in the hundreds in Victoria. People are really distressed, right? But what the message I want people to say is that there are a lot of amazing people working really bloody hard to make things better and to take this on. And there is like people are there is support there, and I hear incredible stories about where people do get support. And so I just want people to not let the negative get in the way of diminishing their, what I was saying before, diminishing their options around choice. I want to be honest with you, everyone in this room, I believe we've got a really bumpy road ahead of us around because of these challenges to rights-based. But I believe in my heart, like, I just think that we can rise to this challenge, and I hope, and the rising needs to come from where people realise that, if we get a legal definition of women, of what it means to be a woman, this is like eugenics. This is like biological essentialism. This is terrible for people with disabilities. This is terrible for all women. And like, we need to reject this on a whole range of bases. And I think, I've written an article that people can find on my Substack called "What is a Woman?" And I set out to talk, and, I strongly believe, like, to be any kind of person in this world, we are not reduced to what's between our legs. Like, God, who we are as people is complex. It's a world around us. It's not our genetics alone. Genetics plays a role. Hormones play a role. Our bodies play a role. But who we are is determined by the people we love and the people around us, and the cultures we're a part of, as much as the people we actually want to be ourselves, as well as our bodies. Those are three components. And so I just want to say, a bumpy road ahead, but if you need help, there's wonderful people out there. And if you're doing some of that wonderful work and you're listening to this, or you're going to because you've just graduated, thank you. We need you. Thank you. We need everybody. We need policymakers. We need supportive politicians, and we bloody well need excellent, progressive lawyers. So on that note, I'll say thank you, and it's been wonderful to be here.
Amen. Joe, thank you so much. Maya, Jade, Luke, thank you so much for being here today, but also the work that you all do individually and as a collective. I think that this conversation today has been thought-provoking, inspiring, worrying, uplifting, all of those things, but certainly has given us all some really important things to take away and think about what we can do and what we need to do, and how to be part of this human community. So thank you all so much for that. I can tell you that the comments have been, everyone has been loving it. So thank you also for our audience for being here. I hope you have a wonderful law week. Merry Law Week. Doesn't have presents, but I can wish you a Merry Law Week, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you so much, everyone.